Maybe I want you to close your eyes for just a second. Picture this scene with me. It's the year 1804. You're standing inside this massive, freezing, cold cathedral. It's Notre Dame in Paris. And the air, it just smells like incense and, old stone. It's a very, very serious ceremony, religious. And the Pope, the most important religious leader in the Catholic world, is standing right there at the altar. He's holding this golden crown. It's actually a laurel wreath made of gold. And he's about to place it on the head of the man who's kneeling in front of him to make him the emperor. But then something just shocking happens. The whole script just flips. The man stands up, he reaches out, and he takes the crown right out of the Pope's hands. He turns around to face the crowd and places it on his own head.
It is a moment of just absolute breathtaking confidence, or maybe you could say absolute arrogance. It's a scene that historians still talk about today. It just breaks every single rule of tradition.
It's unbelievable. Talk about making a statement. You just don't. You don't interrupt the Pope.
It was definitely a statement, and that's the thing. It actually happened. That was the moment Napoleon Bonaparte decided that nobody gives him power. He takes it. And it's arguably the very peak of his entire life story.
And that is exactly where we are going to start today. Welcome to Hello English.
It's great to be here.
So, usually we take a deep dive into these complex topics, right? Technology or business trends. But today our mission is a little bit different, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
We aren't just here to learn a bunch of history facts. We're going to use the life of one of the most famous people who ever lived, Napoleon, to help you master natural spoken English.
That's exactly right. We're going to keep this really simple, friendly, and I hope incredibly useful. I know that history can sometimes feel like a boring lecture, full of dates and dusty old books. But that is not what we're doing today. We're all about the story.
No lectures here. No pop quizzes on dates, I promise.
Exactly. We're going to look at this amazing story of a dramatic rise and an equally dramatic fall. And along the way, we'll use that story to help with your vocabulary, maybe some of your grammar. We want to show you how to talk about ambition, about failure, and, about leadership.
I love this approach. It feels perfect for someone who might be, walking the dog right now, or maybe cooking dinner, or just relaxing on the sofa. You want to improve your English, but you don't want the stress of, staring at a textbook.
Precisely. And I want to say this right at the start. Don't worry about understanding every single word we say, please. Just focus on the flow. Focus on the story itself. If you miss a word, just keep listening. The context will almost always help you figure it out. Language learning is really about immersion, not about perfection.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We need to start with the basics because I think everyone recognizes the hat, right? And the hand in the coat. But who actually was Napoleon Bonaparte?
A great place to start. So in the simplest terms, Napoleon Bonaparte was a French military leader who became the Emperor of France in the early 1800s.
Okay. I want to stop you right there on that word, emperor.
Yeah.
We hear king and queen all the time, right? Especially in fairy tales or, with modern royalty like in the UK. But he wasn't a king. He was an emperor. Is there a difference? Is it just a fancier word?
That's a great question. And yes, there is a very significant difference. A king usually rules a single country, a single kingdom. It's often based on tradition and, bloodlines.
Right.
But an emperor is a ruler who controls an entire empire.
And an empire implies just that it's bigger.
Much bigger. An empire covers many different lands, many different countries, and many, many diverse groups of people. So when we call him an emperor, it implies significantly more power, more reach than a standard king. He wasn't just ruling French people. He was ruling Italians and Germans and Spanish people. He was trying to build a kind of super state.
Okay, so he's like the boss of bosses.
Essentially, yeah. That's a good way to put it.
So was he born into all this power? I assume if you become an emperor, you probably started out as a prince or someone very, very wealthy. Usually in history, power just stays in the family, right?
Yeah, and this is where his story gets really, really interesting. He was not rich. In fact, his family was, they were quite poor. He had zero royal blood.
Really? No way.
Yes. Let's look at his origin story for a second. He was born in 1769, and he wasn't even born in Paris or anywhere near the center of France. He was born on an island called Corsica.
Corsica, I know that name. It's that rugged island in the Mediterranean Sea, right? Is that part of France?
Today, yes.
Okay.
It is definitely part of France. But here's the nuance, the interesting part. When Napoleon was born, back in 1769, Corsica had just become French. Literally the year before. It had been ruled by Genoa, which is part of Italy, before that. So he was born on this island that was still kind of figuring out its own identity.
So he wasn't really, French. French.
Not culturally, no. He grew up speaking a dialect of Italian. He actually, and this is the crazy part, he hated France when he was a boy. He saw them as occupiers of his home island.
Whoa, that is a plot twist. The future emperor of France starts out hating France.
Exactly. So here he is. He's born on an island. His family isn't rich. They were like minor nobility, but with no real money to speak of. And he's a long, long way from the center of power in Paris.
Which brings us to a really key word for today, I think. If he started with nothing and he ended up as emperor, he must have been incredibly... What's the word I'm looking for?
The word we are looking for is ambitious.
Ambitious. I like that word. Let's dig into that a little bit.
To be ambitious means that you really, really want to be successful or powerful or important. It's a strong desire to achieve something great. It's not just a wish, it's a drive. Fire.
Okay. So his family was poor, but he was ambitious.
Exactly. He didn't just want to survive. He wanted to rise.
Yeah.
He looked at his life on that small island and just decided, this is not enough for me.
Can we apply this to our listeners, do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, if you are listening to this deep dive right now because you want to get a better job, or you want to travel the world, or you want to speak English fluently, then you are ambitious. You want more from life.
I think everyone listening right now is a little bit ambitious. Okay, so we have this ambitious young boy from Corsica. What happens next for him?
Well, because he was so ambitious, his parents managed to get him a scholarship. They sent him away to a military school in mainland France.
That sounds like a big opportunity, a real ticket out of poverty.
It was. But, it was also a huge obstacle for him. And this is where the story gets quite sad, actually.
Oh, why is that?
Well, just imagine being a young boy, barely 10 years old, so far from home. You arrive at this fancy school in France, but you have a problem. It wasn't an English problem, of course, but he had a language problem. He spoke French with a very, very heavy Corsican accent, which sounded basically Italian.
Oh, I see. So he sounded completely different from all the other kids.
He sounded like a foreigner to them. And kids can be very cruel. The other students at the school were mostly rich aristocrats. And they just made fun of him. They bullied him because of his accent and because he wasn't rich. They'd tease him about his clothes, his weird name, Napoleonic.
Wow. That is a tough situation. I think a lot of people can relate to that feeling of not fitting in, especially when you're trying to speak a language that isn't your first one perfectly. You feel so vulnerable.
Precisely. It can be incredibly isolating. He didn't really have friends to talk to.
So what was his reaction? Cause and effect is important here, you said. Did he just quit? Did he run back to Corsica?
No. And this tells us a lot about his character, even at that young age. Instead of giving up, he reacted by working. He studied harder than everyone else. While the other kids were out playing, he was in the library reading history books. He became obsessed with mathematics and geography. He decided, if they're going to tease me, I'm going to be smarter than all of them.
So the bullying was the cause, and working harder was the effect.
Exactly. He turned that pain into power, into fuel.
Okay, I want to try to use a sentence here to describe him. I want to say he was really putting in the effort, So can I say, at school, Napoleon was very hardly working.
That is a good try. And I am so glad you said that because that is a very, very common mistake, but it is actually incorrect.
Oh, really? It sounds right to me. Hardly working, because hardly comes from hard, doesn't it?
It does look similar, but in English, adding that egly to the word hard changes the meaning completely. It creates a kind of trap for learners.
Okay, so correct me. What should I have said?
You should have said he worked very hard.
He worked very hard. Okay. But why is hardly working so wrong?
This is a little bit of a tricky rule. The word hardly actually means almost not or scarcely.
Wait, really? The opposite?
Yes. If you say Napoleon was hardly working, what you're actually saying is that he was lazy. You're saying he was doing almost nothing, like he was sleeping in class.
Oh, wow. That is the exact opposite of what I meant. I definitely don't want to call the future emperor lazy.
Yeah. It's a dangerous mistake.
Yeah.
I mean, if you tell your boss, I'm hardly working on the project, you might get fired.
That is very good to know. Okay, so let's clarify. If you're sweating and really pushing yourself, you are working hard. Hard is the adverb in that case.
Correct. But if you're, sitting on the sofa watching TV and checking your phone, you are hardly working.
That is a huge difference. Okay, so Napoleon was not lazy. He worked very hard.
Worked very hard. And all that hard work, it paid off. He graduated and became a lieutenant in the artillery.
So he graduates from school. He's clearly smart, he's ambitious, but he's still just a guy from a poor family with a funny accent. How does he make that leap from just being an officer to becoming famous?
For that, we need to set the scene. It's the late 1700s now,
Yeah.
and France is just exploding.
Easy blow.
Metaphorically, yeah. This is the French Revolution.
All right, the revolution, I've heard of the guillotine and all that.
It was a time of absolute chaos. The king and queen were removed from power and eventually, executed. The government was completely unstable. People were angry. There was fighting in the streets. But more importantly, all the neighboring countries, Austria, Prussia, England, they all attacked France because they were terrified of the revolution spreading.
So you've got chaos inside and enemies on the outside.
Absolute chaos. And here's a rule of history and maybe life. When there is chaos, people look for order. They look for safety.
You look for a leader.
Exactly. Because the country was in chaos, it needed strong leaders.
Yeah.
And all the old leaders, the rich nobles, had either run away or been killed. This was Napoleon's huge opportunity. It was a kind of meritocracy born out of desperation.
So he stepped up.
He joined the Revolutionary Army, and he just rose through the ranks incredibly fast. He became a general.
Okay. Vocabulary focus.
General. A general is a very high-ranking military leader. They aren't the ones on the front line holding the rifles. They're the ones planning the strategy and commanding thousands and thousands of soldiers. They move the pieces on the map.
That is a massive jump. He went from being this bullied student to a general commanding armies in his 20s.
In a very, very short time. He was incredibly young for that rank.
But why him? I mean, there must have been other ambitious guys. Why did he succeed where others failed?
Because he was brilliant at it. He was a military genius. He won battles in Italy that other more experienced generals thought were completely impossible. He moved fast. But more than that, he inspired his soldiers. He could stand in front of a tired, hungry army and give a speech that made them want to fight and die for him.
Everyone loves a story where someone starts small and rises up. It's the classic underdog story, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
And by the late 1790s, he wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a celebrity. The people of France loved him because he brought them victories. He was sending art and treasure back to Paris from his campaigns. He was a superstar.
So he has the love of the people and he has the control of the army. I can see where this is going.
It's going straight to that cathedral we talked about at the very beginning.
The people.
1804. The turning point. Napoleon decides that being a general isn't enough anymore. Being the first consul, which was his title then, isn't enough. He wants to be emperor.
And we are back to that scene. He crowns himself.
Yes.
I really want to visualize this action again because it's just so wild. Crowned himself.
Usually in history, a king or an emperor claims that God gave them the right to rule. It's called the divine right of kings. And that's why the Pope, the head of the church, would be the one to physically put the crown on their head. It symbolized that the power comes from above, from God, through the Pope, to the king.
Right. It's like saying God chose me.
But by taking the crown and putting it on his own head, Napoleon was saying something very, very specific. He was saying, I achieved this, my talent, my ambition, my hard work gave me this crown. Not God, not anyone else.
Oh,
I answer to no one.
That is. Wow. It's purely self-made power.
Let's look at the vocabulary here. To crown, it's a verb.
Crown, to officially make someone a king or emperor.
Exactly. You can say he was crowned in 1804, or in this case, he crowned himself.
And earlier, you used a word to describe this kind of personality trait. You said it might be confidence or it might be ego.
Ego. E-G-O.
What exactly does ego mean in this context?
Well, ego is a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance. I mean, everyone has an ego. It helps us protect our identity. But when we talk about Napoleon, we are talking about a big ego, a very strong belief in your own importance.
So if I say, my boss has a huge ego, what am I saying?
You're probably saying your boss thinks he's the smartest, most important person in the room, and perhaps he doesn't listen to others because he thinks he's always right.
It takes a lot of ego to take a crown from the Pope.
It certainly does. It borders on megalomania. But here's the contradiction with him. He had this massive ego, but he also had a very specific leadership style that made people absolutely love him.
What do you mean by that? Usually people with huge egos are, well, they're hard to like.
True. But Napoleon knew how to connect with the man on the ground.
The man on the ground.
The average soldier. There are so many stories about this. Before a big battle, late at night, Napoleon would walk through the camp. He wouldn't just stay in his fancy tent. He would walk among the soldiers who were, sleeping on the ground or sitting by the fire eating their soup.
Just walking around like a normal person.
Yes. And he would stop and talk to them. He'd ask about their families. He would sometimes even remember their names from previous battles. He might say something like, "Hey, Pierre, how is your leg healing from that fight in Italy last year?"
Wow. I mean, imagine being a regular soldier, a nobody, and the Emperor of France knows your name.
It's incredibly powerful. It's what you might call strategic empathy. He made them feel seen.
That makes people feel so important. It's really, really smart leadership.
It is. And this behavior created a very important thing: loyalty.
Loyalty, that's our next key word, isn't it?
Loyalty means strong support or faithfulness. It means you'll stay by someone's side no matter what.
So if I'm a loyal friend, I stay by your side even when things are going badly.
Exactly. The soldiers had this fierce loyalty to Napoleon because he treated them like people, not just numbers or tools. They had a nickname for him, the Little Corporal. They were willing to die for him because they felt he actually cared about them.
So we have ambition, we have ego, we have loyalty. He's on top of the world at this point. He controls most of Europe, France, Italy, Spain, parts of Germany. But this is a history story, and history stories usually have a turning point downwards, don't they?
What goes up must come down. The hubris usually leads to the nemesis, as the Greeks would say.
So, was he always successful?
No. And this leads us to the lesson on failure. Because when you have a massive ego like his, sometimes you start to think you cannot fail. You stop listening to advice, and that is when you make your biggest mistakes.
And what was his biggest mistake?
The year was 1812. He decided to invade Russia.
Ooh. I don't know much about military strategy, but I have heard that invading Russia is generally a bad idea.
It is a terrible idea, especially if you don't finish the job before winter arrives.
But weather.
The Russian winter is absolutely brutal.
Yeah.
Extremely cold, snow, ice, freezing temperatures. Napoleon took this massive army, something like 600,000 men, into Russia. He thought he would win one big decisive battle, and then the Russians would just surrender.
But they didn't.
No. The Russians did something clever. They just kept retreating. They ran away deeper into Russia, and as they ran, they burned their own towns and their own crops. It's called a scorched earth strategy. So Napoleon's army couldn't find any food.
So he's stuck in the middle of Russia with no food, and it's getting colder and colder.
Freezing.
Yeah.
Men were literally dying of cold and starvation while they walked.
Okay, so I want to talk about the grammar of failure here. This is a common place where learners can get stuck. I want to describe the state of his army. Can I say? So his army wasn't prepared.
Ah, you are so close. That's a very typical learner attempt. We just need to fix the grammar a little bit. It should be. His army wasn't prepared.
Wasn't prepared. With the ed.
Right. Or you could say they weren't prepared.
Okay, let's break that down. Why prepared with a D at the end?
This is what we call a passive construction. Or you can think of it as an adjective. We use the past participle, that's the ed form after was or were, to describe a state or a condition.
So prepare is the verb, like I need to prepare for my English test.
Correct. But here, we're describing the state the army was in. They were in the state of not being ready, so they were not prepared.
Okay, let me try another one to make sure I get it. If I go to a restaurant and the meat is raw, can I say the food wasn't cooked?
No, you'd say the food wasn't cooked.
How about if a door is open, the door wasn't locked?
The door wasn't locked. You've got it.
Got it. Okay. So his army wasn't prepared for the cold.
Perfect. And because they weren't prepared, the result was an absolute disaster.
Total defeat.
Total catastrophic defeat. He lost most of his men. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands died. He had to retreat all the way back to France, completely broken.
That must have been a shock for everyone. He was the man who crowned himself. He was the ultimate winner.
And then suddenly, he was the loser. The aura of invincibility he had, it was just gone. The other countries in Europe, England, Russia, Prussia, they saw that he was weak. They smelled blood in the water, as they say. They all joined together and they attacked him.
And this leads to the end of his rule.
Yes. In 1814, Paris was captured. Napoleon was forced to give up the throne. He abdicated.
So what happens to an emperor who loses? Do they just put him in jail? Or execute him?
Well, this is interesting. They didn't put him in a normal prison. They sent him into exile.
Exile. That is a heavy-sounding word. E-X-I-L-E. What does it mean exactly?
To be in exile means you are forced to live somewhere else, usually as a punishment. You're banished from your home country. You're told you can never come back.
Forced to live away from home. That sounds more psychological than just prison.
Exactly. It's a specific kind of punishment that was often used for powerful people. You don't just lock them up. You remove them from the map, from their source of power.
Where did they send him?
At first, they sent him to a pretty nice little island called Elba. which is near Italy. He was actually allowed to be the ruler of this tiny island. But
Do you remember what we said about him at the beginning?
that he was ambitious. He's the guy who took the crown.
Got bored. He escaped.
He escaped from exile? No way.
He did. He escaped in 1815, sailed back to France, raised another army because the soldiers were still loyal, you see. And he tried to rule again for a period we now call the 100 Days.
Unbelievable. That is just pure ambition.
It is. But he was defeated again, finally, at the Battle of Waterloo. And this time, his enemies said, okay, Elbow was obviously too close. We made a mistake.
So they sent him further away.
Much, much further. They sent him to an island called St. Helena.
Where on earth is that? I've never even heard of it.
And that's the point. It is a tiny volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. It is thousands of miles from anywhere. It's one of the most isolated places on Earth.
That sounds incredibly lonely. It was. He lived there for the last 6 years of his life, writing his memoirs, staring at the ocean, thinking about his past glory. He died there in 1821.
What a lonely end for a man who had everything.
From a poor island boy on Corsica to the emperor of most of Europe in Paris to a lonely man on a rock in the middle of the ocean. It's a full circle.
It really is like a movie script. But instead of just watching the movie, we've hopefully learned some English from it.
We have. We've seen how to tell a life story using cause and effect and picked up some great words.
So let's do a comprehensive review. I want to make sure these words really stick in our listeners' brains. I'm going to throw the definition at you, and you give me the word. Are you ready?
I am ready. Let's play some table tennis with vocabulary.
Okay. Word number 1. Wanting to be successful, powerful, or important.
Ambitious.
Correct. Word number 2. A high-ranking military leader who plans the strategy.
General.
Word number 3. The verb meaning to officially make someone a king or a queen.
To crown.
Number 4. Strong support or faithfulness to a person or a cause.
Loyalty.
And the last one. Being forced to live away from your home country as a form of punishment.
Exile.
Perfect. Those are 5 really powerful words you can use in business, in storytelling, or just when you're reading the news.
And let's not forget the grammar. We fixed 2 big, common mistakes today that I hear learners make all the time.
Right. Mistake number 1. The phrase, he was hardly working.
We don't say that unless we mean he was lazy. We say, he worked very hard. Remember, hardly means almost not.
And mistake number 2 was, the army wasn't prepared.
I say, the army wasn't prepared. We need that past participle to describe the state or condition.
Excellent. I feel smarter already.
That is always the goal.
Before we go, I just want to take a moment for reflection. We heard this massive story, this incredible life. What does it all mean?
That is the big question, isn't it?
What stands out to you? What can we and our listeners learn from Napoleon's life?
For me, I think it's the reminder that even the most powerful, most brilliant people make mistakes. Napoleon was a genius in many ways, but he failed because he didn't know when to stop. He just pushed too far.
That's a really good point.
And it kind of connects back to learning English, I think. You might feel like you're failing sometimes. You might feel like you're stuck in the Russian winter of grammar where nothing makes sense. But failure is just part of the journey. Even Napoleon had some really bad days.
That is a great analogy. And I have a question for you, the listener, to think about today. We talked a lot about ambition. Napoleon had a ton of it. It made him an emperor, but it also led directly to his exile because he couldn't stop conquering. So here's the question. Do you think ambition is always a good thing?
That is a provocative question. At what point does healthy ambition become a dangerous thing?
Exactly. Something to mull over while you finish your walk or wash the dishes.
Indeed.
Well, we have reached the end of our journey today.
We have covered a lot of ground. Corsica, Paris, Russia, St. Helena, a whole lifetime.
And hopefully you've picked up some natural English phrases along the way. Remember, language learning happens little by little. You don't need to memorize a dictionary today.
That's right. Just listening, getting used to the sounds, and hearing stories is one of the best ways to learn. Repetition really builds confidence.
So here is a call to action for you. If you learned a new word today, like exile or ambitious, try to use it in a sentence today. Tell a friend, I am very ambitious about learning English. Or, even better, listen to this deep dive again tomorrow. You'll be surprised how much more you understand the second time through.
And please don't be afraid of making mistakes. As we learned today, even Napoleon failed sometimes.
If you found this story interesting, make sure to check out the other videos on our channel for more stories that make English easy. We have deep dives on science, on business, and a lot more history.
Thank you so much for listening today.
Happy English learning.
Goodbye.